The winter of 18 now came early that year. Snow rolled across the prairie like a white ocean, swallowing fences, roads, and hope alike. In a small frontier town tucked between frozen hills, a 14-year-old boy named Eli Carter stood alone outside the general store with everything he owned tied in a burlap sack. Around town, people didn't use his name much anymore. They just called him the orphan boy. A week earlier, his uncle had turned him out with a single sentence. There wasn't enough food for another mouth. Eli hadn't argued. He packed what little he had and walked into the cold with nowhere to go and no one to follow. That was when he noticed the old stone fort. It stood on a low ridge beyond the last row of cabins, a leftover from some long-forgotten war. Its roof had collapsed, and weeds clawed through the cracks in its walls. Children dared each other to run inside it at night. Grown men crossed the road to avoid it. Folks called it the dead pile of rocks. Inside the general store, a yellowed sign hung near the counter. Abandoned fort for sale, $1. The shopkeeper laughed when Eli pointed to it. "You don't want that place, son," he said. "Wind cuts through it like a blade. You'd freeze stiff before Christmas." Eli reached into his pocket and took out a single silver dollar, the last of his savings from chopping firewood and hauling water all summer. "I'll take it," he said. The men by the stove turned to look at him. One shook his head. Another snorted. "Looks like the boy just bought himself a tomb." By sundown, the fort was his. Eli pushed open the warped wooden door and stepped inside. Cold air rushed through the broken roof. Snow dusted the stone floor. The fort smelled of rust, damp earth, and old rain. One wall had crumbled inward, leaving a jagged hole where the wind howled like a living thing. Still, Eli stood there and let out a slow breath. It wasn't much, but it was his. That night, he scavenged scrapboards from behind barns and dragged in a rusted iron stove someone had left beside the road. He stacked loose stones into the widest cracks and packed them with mud. His hands burned from the cold. His boots soaked through. But by midnight, a small fire glowed inside the stove, and the thick stone walls began to trap the warmth. Far below, the town's lanterns glimmered like stars. Inside the ruined fort, Eli wrapped himself in a thin blanket and listened to the wind cry across the hills. They laughed at him that night. They said he wouldn't survive the first storm. They said a dollar couldn't buy a home. But as dark clouds rolled in from the north, Eli Carter stared up at the rough stone ceiling and whispered, "This place will keep me alive." By the second week, everyone in town knew where Eli Carter was sleeping. They saw smoke rising from the old fort at dawn. They saw him walking into town with frost clinging to his coat and stone dust on his hands. Children followed him down Main Street, whispering and laughing. Grown men shook their heads as he passed. "That kid's lost his senses," someone said outside the saloon. "No stove could warm that pile of rocks," another replied. Eli kept his eyes forward. Every morning he returned to the fort with whatever he could carry: broken boards, bent nails, scraps of tin, even an old church pew someone had thrown away. He wedged the wood into the worst gaps in the walls and packed the spaces with mud and straw. The work was slow and stubborn. His fingers cracked. His knuckles bled. But each night, the wind sounded weaker inside his stone shelter. Still, the cold found its way in. At night, Eli curled beside the stove with his boots tucked under his coat. The fire never lasted long. By morning, the ashes were gray and stiff, and the stone floor burned his feet like ice. Some nights he dreamed of his uncle's kitchen, the smell of cornbread, the sound of a kettle singing. Other nights he dreamed he was buried under snow. One afternoon, a group of boys followed him up the ridge. "Hey, Fort King," one shouted. "You find any ghosts in there yet?" They threw pebbles at the broken doorway and ran off laughing. Eli stood still until their footsteps faded, then went back inside and shut the door behind him. When the first real storm hit, it came fast. The sky turned the color of iron. Wind bent the trees low and drove snow sideways across the hills. By nightfall, the road into town vanished beneath white drifts. Inside the fort, Eli fed the stove with his last pieces of wood and wrapped himself in every scrap of cloth he owned. Wind screamed through the cracked wall like a wild animal trying to get in. Snow sifted down from the broken roof and melted against the stone near the fire. Down in town, people pointed toward the ridge. "That boy won't make it through this one," a woman said. By morning, the storm had buried the fort up to its doorway. 2 hunters passed the ridge at noon and saw no smoke. "Guess the kid finally froze," one muttered. But inside the stone walls, Eli Carter was still breathing. The fire had gone out before dawn, but the thick rock around him had held the heat longer than wood ever could. The cold crept in slowly, like an enemy losing its strength. Eli woke with stiff limbs and aching hands, but he woke alive. He sat up and listened. No wind howled inside the fort now. The snow piled outside had sealed the cracks like white mortar. The stone walls, once his curse, had turned into his shield. Eli rose, brushed frost from his hair, and looked around the dim interior of the ruined fort. For the first time since he bought it for $1, he felt something new settle in his chest. Not fear, not loneliness, but the quiet, stubborn belief that this broken place might hold him through the winter after all. After the storm, Eli Carter began to study the fort the way a farmer studies soil. He noticed how the snow packed itself against the outer walls, sealing the cracks he had failed to fill. He noticed how the stone near the stove stayed warm long after the fire died. Most of all, he noticed how the wind no longer ruled the inside of the fort the way it once had. So he changed his plan. Instead of fighting the cold, he started working with it. He dug a shallow trench around the inside wall to keep melting snow from pooling on the floor. He stacked flat stones into a low hearth and shaped mud and clay into a proper chimney. Using an old wagon sheet and tin scraps, he patched the broken roof just enough to stop the snow from falling straight onto his bedroll. Each improvement was small. Together they began to matter. By the third week, smoke rose from the fort in a steady, disciplined line instead of wild bursts. Eli learned how much wood to feed the stove so it wouldn't burn too fast. He learned to open and close gaps in the wall to let smoke out without letting all the heat escape. The fort no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a shelter. Food was harder. Eli set traps along the frozen creek and caught rabbits with stiff white fur. He hung the meat from the ceiling beams and smoked it slowly over low fire. He boiled wild roots in an iron pot and baked flat corn cakes on hot stones. The meals were plain and meager, but they were warm, and warmth counted for more than taste. One afternoon, a fur trader passing through the hills saw smoke rising where no smoke should be. He climbed the ridge and knocked on the door. When Eli opened it, the man blinked in disbelief. "I thought this place was dead," the trader said, stamping snow from his boots. "Didn't know anyone lived up here." Eli didn't say much. He poured the man hot water and shared a strip of smoked rabbit. The trader looked around, touching the stone walls with his glove. "Feels warmer than my cabin," he said. "These rocks hold heat." That night, the trader told the story in town. By the next week, more people walked up the ridge just to see it for themselves. They stood at the doorway and stared at the patched roof, the stone hearth, the narrow sleeping space tucked behind stacked crates. Some of them laughed the same way they always had, but not as loudly. "You really living up here, boy?" one asked. "Through the winter," Eli answered. December deepened its grip on the land. The creek froze solid. The hills turned white and silent. Houses in town burned twice as much wood and still stayed cold. But inside the old fort, the stone walls absorbed the sun by day and gave it back by night. Eli worked with deliberate care now, moving slower but thinking faster. Every board had a purpose. Every fire was measured. The fort was no longer just a place he hid from the storm. It was becoming something else. Not a ruin, not a joke, but a living, breathing stronghold built not with money or pride, but with patience, persistence, and a boy's refusal to vanish quietly into the cold. By January, the hills around the fort were buried under drifts taller than a man. The road into town had narrowed to a single crooked path, and every chimney in the valley smoked from dawn to dark. Folks burned fence posts, broken furniture, anything that would catch fire. Even then, the cold kept winning. One night, a storm rolled in that felt heavier than the others. The sky went black before sundown, and the wind howled like it meant to scrape the town clean off the map. Snow slammed against windows. Roofs groaned under the weight. A barn near the river collapsed before midnight. Inside the fort, Eli Carter fed his stove carefully and listened to the wind beat against the stone walls. The fort did not shake. It did not groan. It simply held. Near dawn, a knock came at his door. Eli froze. No one ever came up the ridge in a storm. He opened the door and found Mrs. Holloway from town standing in the snow, her shawl stiff with ice. Behind her was her husband, carrying their youngest child in his arms. "Our stove went out," she said, voice thin with fear, "and the roof's leaking." Eli stepped aside without thinking. They crowded into the fort, stamping snow from their boots. The child cried at first, then went quiet when the heat touched his cheeks. Mrs. Holloway stared at the stone walls, the glowing stove, the hanging strips of smoked meat. "How is it warmer here than in our house?" she whispered. Before the day was over, 2 more families came. a trapper with frostbitten hands, an old man whose windows had blown out in the night, a woman whose firewood had run out before morning. They stood awkwardly at the doorway, the same people who once laughed when Eli bought the fort for $1. "Mind if we warm up?" one of them asked. Eli nodded and shifted his crate closer to the wall to make space. By evening, the fort was full of quiet breathing and steaming coats. Eli boiled water and shared what food he had, thin soup made from roots and rabbit bones. No one complained. No one joked. They listened to the storm together. When the wind finally died 2 days later, the town looked battered and tired. Chimneys leaned. Doors hung crooked. Fences lay buried in snow. But the old stone fort still stood solid on its ridge, smoke rising straight into the pale sky. Word spread fast. The boys' fort stayed warm. The rocks kept the heat. He took people in. Men who once crossed the street to avoid the place now climbed the hill to study it. They pressed their palms against the stone. They looked at the patched roof and the narrow chimney and shook their heads. "Smart work," one said. Eli said nothing. He just kept tending the fire. That night, as the families went back down the ridge, Mrs. Holloway paused at the door. "Thank you," she said. "We thought you were foolish." Eli met her eyes. "So did I," he said quietly. "At first." She smiled in a way that looked like regret. From that day on, the fort was no longer called a ruin. It was called the warm place on the hill. And the boy who bought it for $1 was no longer the town's joke. He was the one who had built something the cold could not take. Spring came late that year, slow and cautious, as if the land itself needed time to believe winter was truly over. The snow pulled back from the hills inch by inch. The creek began to whisper again beneath its broken ice. In town, doors that had stayed shut for months finally opened, and people stepped outside like survivors of a long siege. The stone fort still stood on its ridge, dark and steady against the pale sky. Eli Carter watched the valley wake up from the top of its wall. His hands were stronger now. His face looked older than 14. The fort behind him no longer felt like a shelter borrowed from luck. It felt earned. Every crack he had sealed, every fire he had measured, every night he had endured had turned that ruined structure into something purposeful. One morning, the town council walked up the hill together. They had never done that before. "We've been talking," the storekeeper said, clearing his throat, "about that fort." Another man stepped forward. "We'd like to buy it from you. Fair price this time. You could build yourself a real house down in town." Eli looked at the stone walls, the narrow chimney, the place where smoke had risen all winter. "This is a real house one," he said. They were quiet for a moment. Then the woman who had lost her firewood during the storm spoke. "You saved lives up here." Eli shifted his weight. "I just didn't want anyone to freeze." So instead of selling the fort, he changed it. By summer, travelers heading west began stopping at the ridge. Trappers, mail riders, families pulling wagons with tired horses. They found a clean hearth, a roof that didn't leak, and a boy who asked for nothing but stories in return. The town started calling it Carter's Fort, not because it was grand, but because it stood when other places failed. Years later, people would say the same thing about Eli himself. He had been abandoned at 14, mocked for buying a ruin, left alone with cold and stone and doubt, but he turned $1 into a refuge. Not by magic, not by luck. By persistence, by patience, by refusing to believe that broken things could not be made useful again. Standing on the ridge at sunset, Eli watched the road wind through the valley and wondered how many people would pass that way long after he was gone. How many would need shelter? How many would think of that winter when a boy proved the town wrong? And now let me ask you, what would you have done if you were 14 and had only $1 and nowhere to go? Would you have walked away, or would you have tried to build something with it? If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and quiet strength, make sure you subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more true-style frontier stories about resilience, survival, and the power of one bold choice. Because sometimes the smallest beginning creates the strongest shelter of all.